Hello everyone, and welcome to Whispered Abyss. Relax, settle in, and get ready as we dive into tonight's story. Let the darkness take you, and let's begin. The town of Waverly Hills was coated in a thick blanket of snow, the kind that crunched underfoot and sparkled under the pale winter sun. The residents loved their snowy winters, and every December, they indulged in an unofficial competition. Who could build the most creative snowman? Every yard had at least one, ranging from traditional to bizarre, their frosty figures adding charm to the holiday season. For Sophie, a high school senior with a passion for art, this year's competition was personal. She and her little brother Jack had lost their mother earlier in the year, and Christmas felt emptier than ever. But building the perfect snowman was a way to distract Jack and bring some semblance of joy back into their lives. "We're going to make the tallest, coolest snowman this town has ever seen," Sophie declared as she grabbed a scarf and gloves. Jack's eyes lit up. "Really? Like, bigger than the ones at the park?" "Bigger and better," she promised. The siblings set to work in their front yard, rolling the snow into 3 massive spheres. Sophie's artistic touch came alive as she added sticks for arms, a carrot nose, and coal eyes, giving the snowman an expressive, almost lifelike face. Jack insisted they use their mom's old scarf, a vibrant red woolen one she always wore during winter. "She'd love it," Jack said softly, and Sophie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. As the sun began to set, their snowman stood tall, almost 7 feet, with an imposing figure and a strangely regal presence. "He looks like a king," Jack whispered, stepping back to admire their work. Sophie tilted her head, noticing something odd. The face looked different from what she'd sculpted. The eyes seemed deeper, darker, almost hollow, and the mouth twisted in a subtle smirk. "Looks good," she said quickly, brushing off the eerie feeling. Later that night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of their small home. Sophie tucked Jack into bed and glanced out at the snowman. It stood in the same place, its shadow stretching unnaturally long under the street lamp's glow. "Just the light," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she turned away, she could have sworn the shadow moved. The next morning, the siblings woke to find that their snowman wasn't alone. "What the?" Sophie stared out the window. 3 smaller snowmen had appeared, lined up in a perfect row behind the first. They were crudely made, their shapes uneven and sloppy, with coal buttons scattered carelessly. "Did you make those?" Sophie asked Jack as they stepped outside. Jack shook his head. "No, I was asleep." Their dad, bleary-eyed and holding a mug of coffee, joined them. "Neighborhood kids probably thought it was funny," he said with a shrug. But Sophie wasn't convinced. The snow was undisturbed around the new snowmen, as if they'd simply appeared. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, she heard soft thuds outside, like footsteps crunching in the snow. Her heart raced as she peeked through the curtain. The snowman's head had turned slightly, its coal eyes now staring directly at her window. Sophie's breath hitched as she stared out the window. The snowman's eyes seemed darker than before, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Its smirking mouth looked wider now, curling up at the edges in a way that made her stomach churn. She blinked, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. "It's the shadows," she whispered, closing the curtain quickly. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she swore she could hear the faintest sound, a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't clear, just fragments of words, soft and urgent, like someone murmuring just outside her room. When the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, Sophie got out of bed and hurried to check the snowman. Jack was already outside, staring at the yard with wide, confused eyes. "Sophie," he called nervously, "you need to see this." The snowmen weren't where they had been. The original snowman stood several feet closer to their house, and the 3 smaller ones flanked it, forming a tight semicircle. Their arrangement felt purposeful, almost menacing. Worse still, the snowman's head had tilted again, now staring directly at the front door. Sophie felt her stomach twist. "Okay, Jack, let's just go back inside for now." "But now!" That evening, Sophie tried to tell their dad about the strange occurrences, but he brushed it off. "Sophie, it's just snow. Stop scaring your brother with ghost stories," he said, ruffling Jack's hair. "I'm not making this up," Sophie snapped. "The snowman moved." Her dad sighed, looking exhausted. "It's probably the wind, or maybe the snow settled differently. Just let it go, okay?" Frustrated, Sophie returned to her room. She stayed awake for hours, determined to prove she wasn't crazy. Around midnight, she crept to her window and peeked through the curtain. The snowman had moved again. It was now standing directly at the edge of the porch, close enough that she could see the rough details of its face. The coal eyes seemed to bore into her, and the twisted smile had grown even wider. Sophie's heart raced as the whispering started again, louder this time. "Come outside." She stumbled back from the window, her breath coming in short gasps. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, hugging her knees. Then Jack screamed. Sophie bolted to her brother's room, throwing the door open. Jack was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face. "The snowmen!" he cried. "They're at my window!" Sophie ran to the window and pulled back the curtain. Sure enough, the 3 smaller snowmen were lined up outside, their crude shapes eerily backlit by the street lamp. One of them had a stick arm raised, pointing directly at Jack's room. Sophie didn't wait to see more. "Dad!" she yelled, dragging Jack out of bed. Her dad came stumbling out of his room, half asleep and irritated. "What's going on now?" "They're moving! The snowmen are right outside Jack's window," Sophie shouted. Her dad groaned and marched to the front door. "Enough of this! I'll show you it's just snow." "Dad, don't..." But he was already outside. The cold night air hit Sophie like a slap as she and Jack followed their dad to the yard. He stomped up to the snowmen, muttering about kids playing pranks. But as he reached out to push the first snowman over, he froze. "Dad!" Sophie called nervously. Her dad stood motionless, his hand hovering just above the snowman's chest. "What the..." Suddenly, the snowman's head jerked to the side, its coal eyes locking onto him. "Get back!" Sophie screamed, grabbing Jack's hand and pulling him toward the house. Her dad staggered backward, but the snowman lurched forward, its body moving with unnatural fluidity. "What is this?" her dad yelled, stumbling as the snowman raised one stick arm and swung. He barely dodged, the sharp branch slashing through the air with a sickening crack. The other snowmen began to move, their lurching, uneven steps crunching in the snow. Sophie and Jack scrambled inside, slamming the door behind them. "Dad!" Sophie screamed through the window, but her dad was running toward the house, the snowmen close behind. Just as he reached the porch, one of the smaller snowmen lunged forward, wrapping its icy arms around his legs. He fell with a cry, clawing at the ground as the snowman began dragging him back toward the yard. "Dad!" Jack yelled, tears streaming down his face. Sophie didn't think. She grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace and burst out the door, running toward her father. Sophie's boots slipped on the icy porch as she ran toward her dad. The fire poker felt heavy in her hands, but she gripped it tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let him go!" she screamed, raising the poker high. The snowman holding her dad's legs didn't flinch. Its stick arms dug deeper into his pants, shredding the fabric as it dragged him across the yard. The snow crunched loudly under its movements, as though the snowman itself were heavier than it should be. With a wild swing, Sophie slammed the fire poker into the snowman's head. The coal eyes shattered, scattering across the ground like tiny black stones. For a moment, the snowman froze, releasing its grip on her father's legs. "Dad, get up!" Sophie yelled. Her dad scrambled to his feet, limping toward the house, but the other 2 smaller snowmen began closing in. Their movements were jerky, almost spider-like, as they clawed through the snow. One lunged at Sophie, its jagged branch arm swiping inches from her face. She swung the poker again, hitting its torso. This time, the snow cracked and fell apart, but Sophie's relief was short-lived. The snowman reassembled itself in seconds, pulling the fallen pieces of snow back into its form, as if guided by some invisible force. "What are these things?" her dad shouted as he reached the porch, clutching his leg. "I don't know," Sophie cried, backing away. She swung again and again, but the snowmen kept coming, reforming no matter how many times she shattered their bodies. Finally, Sophie turned and ran, dragging Jack by the arm. "Inside, now!" Slamming the door shut, Sophie locked it and pressed her back against the wood. Jack was sobbing, and her dad leaned heavily against the wall, wincing in pain. "We need help," her dad said, his voice shaky. "Call the police." Sophie grabbed her phone and dialed, her hands trembling. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Waverly Police Department. Please, you have to come. There's something in our yard. These snowmen, they're alive, Sophie blurted, her words tumbling over each other. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Miss, this is a prank, right? No, Sophie shouted. They attacked my dad. They're still out there. She reached it in moments, her breath forming icy clouds in the air. With shaking hands, Sophie grabbed the end of the scarf. The snowman's head turned toward her, its coal eyes burning with malice. The chilling voice returned, low and mocking. Do you really think you can stop us? Sophie swallowed hard, but didn't hesitate. She yanked the scarf off, the fabric tearing slightly. The moment it was freed, the snowman's head seemed to collapse, its body disintegrating into a pile of snow. The other snowmen stiffened, as if they were frozen in place, but Sophie didn't feel a sense of victory just yet. She had no idea if this was truly over. Dad! Jack! Get out here! She shouted. Inside, Sophie's dad and Jack had cautiously made their way to the door, peeking out to see what was happening. When they saw the large snowman crumble into nothingness, they hesitated for only a moment before stepping outside. Sophie was standing by the pile of snow, staring at it, her heart still racing. It worked, she said, relief flooding through her. But then the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. What's happening? Jack cried out, his voice panicked. The other snowmen, still standing in the yard, slowly began to twitch. Their coal eyes flickered, then burned brighter, as if they were fueled by an unseen force. No, Sophie whispered, taking a step back. It's not over. The snowmen's bodies started to reassemble, faster than before, as if the pieces of snow were magnetically drawn together. The wind howled louder, as though urging them forward. I thought the scarf, Sophie started, but her dad grabbed her arm. We need to get inside, now, he shouted. Sophie's mind raced, but she knew her father was right. They couldn't face these creatures head-on anymore. They needed another plan. The snowmen were closing in, their eyes burning with cold rage. Sophie glanced at the shed in the distance. It seemed like their only chance now. We're not going to make it, are we? Jack whimpered, looking back at the advancing snowmen. Sophie grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the shed. We are. We just have to stick together. Don't stop running. They ran toward the shed, the snowmen's hollow voices chanting behind them. Join us. Join us. We're waiting. Sophie dared a glance over her shoulder. The snowmen were faster now, moving with unnatural speed, their limbs stretching in disturbing ways. Her father was limping behind, struggling to keep up. I can't keep going. Sophie, help. Just a little longer, Dad, she cried, pulling Jack along. With one final burst of energy, they reached the shed and slammed the door shut. Sophie fumbled to lock it, her hands numb from the cold. They huddled together in the dark, the only sound the pounding of their hearts, but the wind kept whispering, taunting them. We will never stop until you join us. Sophie's breath echoed in the silence of the shed as she pressed her ear against the wooden door. Outside, the wind howled, but it wasn't just the wind. It was the eerie chanting of the snowmen. Their voices seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding them, filling the air with a sense of cold, unrelenting malice. We will never stop until you join us. The voice sounded impossibly close, as if the snowmen were right outside the door. Sophie held her breath, eyes wide in fear. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, the beating thundering in her ears. Her father sat against the far wall, his leg elevated on a stack of crates. Jack was beside him, trembling violently, clutching Sophie's hand like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Dad, what are we going to do? Sophie whispered, trying to keep the fear from overtaking her voice. Her father's face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken from exhaustion and pain. He gritted his teeth, holding back tears. I don't know, Sophie. I don't know how we can stop them. Sophie's mind raced. She thought of the scarf, the key, it seemed, to the snowman's power. When she had removed it from the largest snowman, it had disintegrated into nothingness. But now the others were regrouping. They hadn't truly been defeated. What if it's not the scarf? Sophie murmured aloud, the thought hitting her with a sudden clarity. What if it's something else? What if it's the snow itself? Her father's head snapped toward her. What are you talking about? The snow? I don't know, Sophie said, her voice trembling but determined. But when we were building the snowmen, They were all made from the snow around the yard. What if the snow, it's cursed? What if the snowmen are part of the curse, and as long as this snow remains here, they can't truly be stopped? Jack shuddered. You mean we're stuck with them forever? No, Sophie said, her voice steady. We're not stuck, but we have to destroy the snow itself. Her father looked skeptical. How do you plan to do that? You can't just melt snow, Sophie. It's winter. The ground is frozen solid. Sophie didn't have an answer. The idea had come to her in a rush, a wild theory, but she had no idea how to execute it. She glanced around the shed, desperately searching for any sign of hope. Then she saw the woodpile in the corner. Wait, she said, getting an idea. What if we can burn it? The snow might not melt, but if we burn the surrounding wood, maybe it will weaken the curse. Her father's face was filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. Burn the snow? That sounds crazy. I know, Sophie said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. But we don't have a choice. They're getting closer, and I don't think they'll stop until they get us. Jack let out a strangled sob. I don't want to die. I don't want to be one of them. Sophie's heart clenched. She turned toward the small pile of dry logs in the corner of the shed. If she could get a fire going, maybe, just maybe, it would weaken the hold the snowmen had over the yard. She pulled herself to her feet, despite the fatigue in her limbs. We don't have time to waste, she said, her voice shaky but resolute. I'll make a fire. You two stay here and stay quiet. If anything happens, run for the house. Understand? Her father nodded, his eyes full of worry but unwilling to argue. Sophie quickly gathered the logs and stacked them in a small pile. She found some matches in a drawer and, with shaking hands, lit the first one. The tiny flame flickered before catching on the dry wood. She leaned closer, holding her breath as the fire began to grow. For a moment, the warmth of the fire filled the shed, giving Sophie a brief sense of safety. But then she heard it. A sound outside, the unmistakable crunch of snow beneath heavy boots. The snowmen were out there. Sophie's heart stopped. She glanced at her father and Jack, both of whom were staring at the door with wide, terrified eyes. The chanting was growing louder again, but this time, it wasn't just the snowmen's voices. Sophie heard another sound mixed in, the soft whisper of snow shifting, a presence that felt far darker than anything they had faced before. What is that? Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Sophie didn't answer. She could feel it too, a sinister force creeping closer. She had hoped the fire would give them time, but the snowmen weren't waiting anymore. The door to the shed began to creak. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The snowmen were right outside, but something was different this time. The air had grown colder, more suffocating. The door shuddered as something heavy pressed against it. The creaking grew louder, as if the snowmen were trying to break through. Sophie's heart raced as she clutched the matchbox in her trembling hands. The fire she had started was growing, but it seemed to be doing nothing to stop the encroaching darkness. Outside, the snowmen's chant was now a cacophony, a low, guttural hum that reverberated through the walls of the shed. Stay calm, Sophie whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow. She turned toward her father and Jack, both of whom were pressed against the far wall, their faces pale and stricken with fear. We have to finish this. We have to break the curse. Her father nodded, his eyes wide with panic. How? The snowmen are here. They're coming for us. Sophie didn't have an answer, but she could feel it. Whatever magic had bound the snowmen to this cursed snow was nearing its peak. The fire was their last chance, but only if they could keep the shed from being overrun. With her hand still gripping the matchbox, Sophie stepped closer to the fire, adding another log to the growing flames. The wood cracked and snapped, sending bursts of light and heat into the small space. But just as the warmth of the fire reached its peak, a cold wind howled through the cracks in the shed's walls. The temperature inside dropped precipitously. Suddenly, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Sophie gasped, and her heart stopped. The snowmen stood in the doorway, their frozen faces leering at them. But this time, they weren't simply standing. They were moving, their limbs jerking in unnatural ways, as if their very existence was a twisted mockery of life. You're too late, a voice rasped from one of the snowmen, the words echoing unnaturally as if the snowmen were speaking as one. The curse has already begun. Sophie backed away from the fire, the flames flickering in her eyes. She could hear the snowmen's raspy breath, the weight of their presence closing in around her. Why do you want us?" Jack choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "To join us," the snowman's voice rasped, its hollow eyes fixed on Sophie. "To become one with the snow, forever." The ground trembled as the snowmen moved closer, their frosty fingers reaching out. The temperature dropped even further, and the air was thick with the scent of ice and decay. Sophie could feel the cold creeping into her bones, threatening to freeze her from the inside out. But then, Sophie remembered something. The scarf that had disintegrated when she had pulled it from the largest snowman. It wasn't just the snowmen that were cursed, it was everything that had been touched by the snow. She turned to her father. "We need to burn it all. The snow, the scarf, everything." Her father nodded, understanding the urgency in her voice. They had to destroy the very heart of the curse before it consumed them all. Sophie grabbed a handful of matches and tossed them into the fire, the flames growing brighter, hotter. She stood tall, her legs shaking, but her resolve was firm. She would not let the snowmen win. They would burn. In a frantic motion, Sophie grabbed another log and shoved it into the fire, the flames rising up in an inferno. The heat in the shed intensified, pushing back against the freezing cold of the snowmen's presence. But it wasn't enough. The snowmen stepped forward, their frozen forms unyielding, as if the fire had no effect on them at all. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't give up now. She had to find a way to break the curse, to set things right. Suddenly she saw it, a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. The scarf. It was still lying on the floor, a tattered remnant of the snowman it had once belonged to. The sight of it sparked something inside Sophie. She knew what she had to do. "Get back!" Sophie shouted as she rushed toward the scarf. She grabbed it and held it up to the fire. For a moment, nothing happened, but then a spark caught. The fabric began to smolder, and within seconds, the scarf was ablaze, flames licking at its edges. As the scarf burned, the temperature in the shed surged and the snowmen faltered. The snowmen's chanting grew louder, more desperate, as if the fire was weakening them. Sophie clutched the scarf tightly in her hands, feeling the heat burn through her gloves. The flames crackled and roared, consuming the fabric in a blaze of bright orange. Then, something strange began to happen. The snowmen stopped moving. Their frozen eyes seemed to lose their luster. The curse that had bound them to the snow began to unravel. "No!" one of the snowmen cried, its voice distorted and broken. "This is impossible!" The snowmen stumbled back, their once menacing figures flickering and warping as the fire consumed the curse that held them. Sophie, her breath coming in ragged gasps, threw the scarf into the heart of the fire. The flames roared, and the snowmen let out a collective wail before their bodies disintegrated into dust. Their forms collapsed, leaving only the remnants of snow where they had once stood. The temperature in the shed slowly returned to normal, the warmth from the fire creeping back into the space. Sophie stood there, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was over. The curse was broken. The snowmen were gone. But as she turned to look at her father and Jack, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. The snow outside had begun to fall again, covering the yard in a thick layer of white. And in the distance, Sophie could swear she saw the faint outline of a new figure, one that had not been there before, a new snowman.